3 weeks before Nat King Cole died, he walked into a recording studio in San Francisco and sang love songs. He had just been told he had lung cancer. The tumor in his left lung was advanced. His doctors had given him months. He was 45 years old, and he had been smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day since before most of his fans were born. The doctors told him not to go. He went anyway. Between December 1st and 3rd, 1964, Cole completed what would become his final album. He called it L.O.V.E. He recorded The Girl from Ipanema. He recorded a theme from an Italian documentary film. He recorded Coquette and 3 Little Words, and songs that had nothing on the surface to do with dying. His voice on those sessions is warm and unhurried, floating over Ralph Carmichael's lush orchestral arrangements with the same liquid ease it had always carried. You would not know, listening, that the man singing had just received a terminal diagnosis. You would not know he was recording against his doctor's explicit orders, or that he checked into a hospital 4 days after the last session ended, or that he would be dead 10 weeks later. His daughter Natalie said afterward that he recorded those final songs to make sure his family would be taken care of. He knew the album would sell. He knew even then what his voice was worth. That's the thing about Nat King Cole that is hardest to explain across the distance of 60 years. The voice was not just famous. It was not just beautiful. It was the instrument through which a black man from Alabama, who had been physically attacked on a stage in Birmingham and abandoned by every major national advertiser in the country, had somehow become one of the most beloved performers in the history of American popular music. The voice did something that the era's institutions consistently refused to do. It crossed every line they tried to draw. Nathaniel Adams Coles was born in Montgomery, Alabama, on March 17, 1919. His father, Edward, was a Baptist minister. His mother, Perlina, directed the church choir and was its soprano soloist. When Nat was 4, the family moved to Chicago. He was learning to play the organ by ear from his mother before he started school. By 12, he had begun formal lessons in classical piano, but the city was already doing something to him that the lessons couldn't account for. Chicago in the late 1920s and early 30s was one of the great crucibles of American jazz, and the young Coles, he still had the S on his name then, would slip out at night to stand outside the clubs and listen. Earl Fatah Hines played Chicago. Louis Armstrong played Chicago. Nat Coles absorbed them through the walls. He dropped out of high school at 15 to pursue a career as a jazz pianist. That was 1934. He had nothing yet except the talent and the ambition, and for several years those were enough to keep him moving without making him solvent. He toured in a revival of the Black musical revue Shuffle Along, playing piano in the pit. He married a dancer in the cast named Nadine Robinson. When the show folded in Los Angeles in 1937, he stayed. He needed work, and he found it in the clubs around Hollywood and Santa Monica, where he built a quiet reputation among people who paid close attention to piano. He dropped the S from his surname somewhere in those years. He became Nat Cole. He picked up the nickname King from the nursery rhyme, Old King Cole was a merry old soul. And for a while the name had something ironic about it. A young jazz pianist working the small rooms without a drummer, playing with a guitarist named Oscar Moore and a bassist named Wesley Prince. The trio had no drums. This was not an accident or a budget constraint. The space where a drum kit would have been created something unusual, a kind of precision and openness that larger ensembles couldn't replicate. In the drumless format, every note Cole played was exposed. There was nowhere to hide, and Cole had nothing to hide. His right-hand lines had a singing quality even before his voice entered the picture, melodic, unhurried, with a light touch that conveyed assurance rather than effort. The trio built a following the slow way, through club residencies and radio appearances, and the kind of word of mouth that only spreads among people who feel they've discovered something, Bing Crosby heard them one night drifting out of a restaurant near Cole's hotel and took Johnny Mercer to listen. Mercer was already one of the most celebrated American songwriters, and within a few years, he would co-found Capitol Records. He remembered what he heard. Cole's singing career began, by most accounts, as an accident. A drunk customer at a small Hollywood club wouldn't stop demanding that he sing Sweet Lorraine. Cole had been playing it as an instrumental. He sang it. The room responded in a way that surprised him. He had always thought of himself primarily as a pianist. The voice was secondary, something he did to fill requests. The audience had other ideas, and as the 1940s arrived, those ideas became increasingly hard to argue with. In 1943, Capitol Records, the new label founded by Mercer and producer Buddy DeSilva and record store owner Glenn Wallachs, signed the King Cole Trio. The label was less than a year old and needed something to build around. Cole was a proven live draw with a devoted, if not yet enormous, following. Their first Capitol session produced a song Cole had written years earlier, based on a parable from one of his father's sermons. A foolish buzzard carrying a monkey, being told to straighten up and fly right before he drops him. Cole had sold the rights to this song for $50 some time before Capitol came calling. He earned nothing extra from what happened next. Straighten Up and Fly Right reached the top of the black charts in April 1944 and stayed there for 10 weeks. It also crossed to the pop chart and to the country chart, which was then called the folk chart, landing in the top 10 of both. A song by a black jazz trio on a fledgling independent label, playing on radio stations in rooms where none of its creators would have been welcome to sit down for dinner. That was 1944, and it was both a commercial fact and a cultural rupture that the industry took note of and immediately began to work around. The Christmas song arrived in 1946. It is nearly impossible now to hear it fresh because it has become so woven into American December that the song and the season feel interchangeable. Mel Torme wrote it on a hot summer day in July, trying to think cool thoughts. Cole recorded it first with strings, which was then a fairly new configuration for him, and the combination of his voice against that warm orchestral texture turned out to be the sound that would define the next phase of his work. He would re-record the song 3 more times over the course of his career. The fourth and final version, recorded in stereo in 1961, is the one most often heard today. The transition from jazz pianist to pop vocalist happened gradually from inside and suddenly from outside. Cole kept playing piano on his recordings well into the late 1940s and beyond, and those who paid attention knew they were hearing one of the finest jazz pianists of his generation, an heir to Hines, a direct influence on Oscar Peterson, a player whose technique was so controlled and so musical that jazz critics later mourned his partial departure from the form the way they'd mourned Dylan going electric. But the voice was what sold records to everyone, not just to jazz listeners. And Nat King Cole was practical about this in a way that some found admirable and others found troubling. Nature Boy was 1948, a strange mystical song by an eccentric songwriter named Eden Abez, who had been living rough in the hills near the Hollywood sign and left a manuscript at Cole's manager's office. Cole recorded it, heard something in the thing that others might have dismissed, and the record went to number 1. Mona Lisa was 1950, a film theme that hit the top of the pop chart and went gold. Too Young was 1951. Unforgettable was 1951. By the time those records were out, Cole ranked alongside Sinatra and Como and Dean Martin as one of the premier male vocalists in American music. He was also, in essentially every context outside of that music, still living in a country that viewed him through a very different lens. He bought a house in the Hancock Park neighborhood of Los Angeles in 1948, an enclave of old money and restrictive covenants in the hills above the city. The Hancock Park Property Owners Association sent a formal delegation to ask him not to move in. Cole reportedly told them that if he saw anyone in his neighborhood more objectionable than himself, he'd be the first to complain. He moved in. Neighbors placed a sign reading "Nigger Heaven" on his property. Someone left garbage on his lawn. He absorbed these things and kept working. This was not passivity. It was a particular form of commitment to his career, to his family, to the idea that the music could reach places the segregation laws had not yet thought to regulate. Whether that idea was correct is something the evidence answers only partially. The records sold across the color line in a way that almost nothing else in 1950s American commercial culture did. Whether selling records changed anyone's fundamental view of anyone else is a different question. He kept performing in the South throughout the early 1950s, playing segregated venues. A white show and a separate black show on the same night in the same city. The black press came after him for it. The New York Amsterdam News and other papers accused him of accommodation, of making it easier for Jim Crow to persist by participating in its arrangements. The language was sometimes harsh. Uncle Nat, he was hurt by it and he pushed back, but gently. His position was that refusing to perform in the South would not change the South. His presence in those rooms, singing to audiences who would not have sat next to each other on a city bus, was itself a kind of argument, not a loud one, but a persistent one. Then came Birmingham, and it became clear how thin the protection of that argument actually was. April 10, 1956. Cole was performing at the Municipal Auditorium in Birmingham, Alabama. He had scheduled 2 shows as required by the city's segregation ordinances, one for white audiences, one for black. He was midway through the 3rd song of the first set, a ballad called "Little Girl," when 4 men came running down the aisles toward the stage. They were members of the North Alabama Citizens Council. Their apparent intent was to drag Cole off the stage, possibly to kidnap him. The police had been tipped off in advance and were present in unusual numbers, which is why the attack was stopped before it could become something worse. But in the melee, one of the attackers reached Cole and knocked him from his piano bench. He fell. He hurt his back. The house lights came up. The curtain dropped. The men were taken away. And then, after the room had quieted and a doctor had looked him over, Nat King Cole walked back out onto the stage. The white audience that had watched him get knocked off his piano bench gave him nearly 10 minutes of applause. He told them, "I just came here to entertain you. That was what I thought you wanted. I was born in Alabama." He said he couldn't continue because of his back. He walked off again to more applause. Then, later that night, he went and did the 2nd show, the Black Show, as scheduled. It remains one of the strangest and most affecting moments in the history of American popular entertainment. A man attacked on a stage in a segregated auditorium in the state where he was born, returning to that stage to address his attacker's audience with a sentence that contains no anger and no appeal for sympathy, just a statement of origin and intention. "I was born in Alabama." He finished performing for the black audience afterward. He flew home. He did not perform in the South again. That fall, NBC gave him a television show. He became the first black American to host a national network variety program. The Nat King Cole Show debuted on November 5, 1956. Cole sang standards and Broadway songs. He sat at the piano with Oscar Peterson and Ella Fitzgerald. He brought in Harry Belafonte and Frankie Lane and Peggy Lee, many of them performing for minimal pay because they believed in what he was doing. The ratings were respectable. The production was polished. Cole was warm and elegant on screen, not straining to prove anything, just present, the way a person is present when they've been performing for 20 years and have nothing left to prove. Not a single major national advertiser would sponsor it. The logic was never stated in public in those terms. What happened instead was a series of polite conversations between NBC's sales department and the marketing divisions of major American corporations, in which the corporations explained in the language of market research and regional sensitivity that their products' southern distribution networks created challenges that made a national association with a black television host financially impractical at this time. Regional advertisers filled pieces of the gap: a beer company in New York, wine brands in California, Coca-Cola in Houston. But the patchwork never coalesced into the national sponsorship the show required to survive. NBC paid the production costs out of its own pocket for over a year, waiting for a sponsor that never came. In December 1957, after 53 episodes, Cole pulled the plug himself. What he said about it afterward became the thing people remember. Madison Avenue is afraid of the dark. He was not wrong, and he knew he was not wrong, and knowing it didn't make it easier. He kept recording through the late 1950s and into the 1960s. Nelson Riddle, his longtime arranger and one of the key creative partnerships of his career, left Capitol for Frank Sinatra's Reprise Records in 1960. The pop landscape had been rearranged by rock and roll, and the labels were uncertain what to do with vocalists who had built their audiences in the previous decade. Cole adapted rather than resisted. He tried a country-inflected sound and got a #2 hit with Ramblin' Rose in 1962. He followed it with Those Lazy Hazy Crazy Days of Summer, which made the top 10. He toured Japan, his first visit, toured South America, and was received at the Brazilian president's palace. He performed at President Kennedy's inaugural ball. He played a command performance for Queen Elizabeth II. He was also smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day and had been doing so for the better part of his adult life. Some who knew him said he'd convinced himself the cigarettes helped keep the lower, grainier register of his baritone. Whatever he told himself, his body was keeping its own account. In September 1964, he began losing weight. He had back pain that wouldn't resolve, different from the back pain that had come and gone since Birmingham. He collapsed after a performance at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. His management called it a respiratory ailment and said no more. He kept performing. In December, he was working a residency in San Francisco when friends finally persuaded him to see a doctor. A chest X-ray found a malignant tumor in an advanced state of growth on his left lung. The diagnosis was lung cancer. He was expected to have only months. His doctors told him to go directly to the hospital. He told them he had recording sessions booked. December 1st through 3rd, 1964. Coast Recorders in San Francisco. The sessions ran for a few hours each afternoon. Cole recorded 11 songs in 3 days, completing the album whose title track he'd already cut in Hollywood 6 months earlier. Ralph Carmichael conducted the orchestra. The personnel records list the musicians with the precision that studio ledgers require. Trumpet soloists, woodwind players, the clock times of each session down to the half hour. The sessions ran smoothly. Nothing in the documentation suggests a crisis. Cole sang. He recorded The Girl from Ipanema, the Brazilian bossa nova that Jobim and De Moraes had written in 1962 and that João Gilberto and Stan Getz had already made famous. He recorded More, a theme from an Italian documentary about extreme human behavior called Mondo Cane. A strange choice in retrospect, though Cole presumably chose it because it was a beautiful melody and not because of the film it came from. He recorded Coquette, a song that had been around since 1928, written by Johnny Green and Gus Kahn and Carmen Lombardo. He recorded 3 Little Words and Swiss Retreat, and There's Love, and Your Love. Love in as many configurations as 3 days could hold. Natalie Cole said later that he did it for the family. He knew the record would be released. He knew what records like this one sold, and to how many people. He was 45 years old and he was buying time for the people he would leave behind in the only currency he had ever really controlled. He checked into St. John's Health Center in Santa Monica on December 7th or 8th, depending on which account you read. Cobalt radiation therapy began on December 10th. Frank Sinatra, who had been scheduled to share a bill with Cole at the opening of the new Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles 2 days later, performed in his place. Hundreds of thousands of cards and letters arrived at the hospital as news of Cole's illness became public. He was able to see some of them when he was briefly released over the New Year's period. On January 25, 1965, surgeons removed his entire left lung. The operation went as well as an operation of that kind went in 1965, which is to say that it was brutal and the prognosis remained dark. His father died of unrelated heart problems 1 week later, on February 1st. Cole was still in the hospital. He received the news from his bed. The day before he died, February 14th, Valentine's Day, his wife, Maria, took him on a drive to Santa Monica to look at the sea and at a house they had been thinking about buying. He looked out the window at the house and said, according to Maria, "Go ahead and buy it, Skis." Skis was his nickname for her. That was the last time he left the hospital. Nat King Cole died in his sleep at 5:30 in the morning on February 15th, 1965. He was 45 years old. LOVE had been released 2 weeks earlier and was climbing the charts. The album peaked at number 4 on the Billboard chart that spring. The reviews were enthusiastic. Billboard magazine called it one of the finest albums he'd ever made, praised his voice's warmth and vitality, said he breathed new life into the material. The critic had no way of knowing when those words were written that the sessions they described had taken place 4 days before the singer entered the hospital for the last time, against the explicit advice of his doctors, with a terminal diagnosis already in hand. He sounded, on those recordings, like a man with all the time in the world. That is partly what makes them so difficult to sit with now. The ease in his voice on The Girl from Ipanema, the slight swing he puts into the bossa nova rhythm, the casual warmth he brings to lyrics about a girl walking to the sea, carries none of the weight of what you know when you listen. He never sang those songs as if they were farewell. He sang them the way he'd always sung everything, completely, without indicating where it was going, letting the music arrive in the room before the listener had time to prepare. This is the thing his daughter Natalie spent decades coming to terms with. She was 14 when he died. She had grown up in a household full of music and success and the particular kind of complicated privacy that very famous people maintain, and she had watched her father work himself toward the end with a discipline she found both admirable and impossible to fully understand. She became a singer herself. She had her own career, her own hits, her own Grammy Awards, and then in 1991, she went into a studio and recorded new vocals over her father's 1961 stereo recording of Unforgettable, mixing her voice with his in a posthumous duet that won 7 Grammy Awards and introduced Nat King Cole's catalog to listeners who hadn't been born when he was alive. It was an act of love and also an act of technological audacity, and it raised questions about memory and presence and what a recording actually preserves that critics and listeners have never quite finished arguing about. Her voice and his voice together on the same record, separated by 40 years, sounding as if they were singing to each other. He had recorded it in 1951 when she was 1 year old. In 1983, 18 years after his death, an archivist at an EMI subsidiary in Germany was working through old storage and found recordings that had never been released. Cole's voice on songs no one had heard, including a version in Japanese and one in Spanish. Capitol put them out as a record called Unreleased. His voice, arriving from storage in a language most of his American listeners didn't speak, still recognizable as his. Still that voice. What the voice was, technically, was a lyric baritone with an unusually wide emotional range and an almost complete absence of artifice. Cole had good diction, careful phrasing, an instinct for where to place weight in a lyric and where to leave space. He had learned to sing, essentially, by listening, first to the congregation in his father's church, then to the jazz musicians in the Chicago clubs. then to the specific demands of the rooms he worked in through his 20s. He was never formally trained as a vocalist. The voice was, in some sense, a jazz instrument, responsive, improvisatory within the form, capable of suggesting more than it stated. The jazz critics, who resented his turn toward pop, had a point, and Cole acknowledged it. "I started out to become a jazz pianist," he told a Voice of America interviewer sometime in the mid-1950s. "In the meantime, I started singing, and I sang the way I felt, and that's just the way it came out." The pivot was real, and what was lost in it, the piano work, the trio recordings, the lateral movement through jazz that he might have kept developing, was genuinely lost. But what replaced it was not a lesser thing. It was a different thing made by the same person, aimed at a different and larger audience, carrying its own weight and its own particular form of beauty. He had 28 gold records. He had a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. He was posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2000 and given a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 1990. His 1944 hit, "Straighten Up and Fly Right," is in the Library of Congress's National Recording Registry. The Christmas song was added to the same registry in 2022, more than 75 years after he first recorded it. None of those things are the point, though they are facts. The point is harder to put into numbers. The radio interviewer who spoke to Cole on February 14, 1965, the same Valentine's Day that Maria drove him to see the house, asked how he was feeling. Cole told him, "I am feeling better than ever. I think I've finally got this cancer licked." He died the following morning. Whether he believed that or was performing it for the audience on the other end of the radio is a question with no reliable answer. Cole had been managing the distance between his public self and his private circumstances for his entire adult life. He had done it on stages in segregated auditoriums. He had done it in television studios in front of cameras belonging to a network that couldn't sell him to advertisers. He had done it in a San Francisco recording studio in December 1964, singing "The Girl from Ipanema" with a tumor in his lung and 4 days left before he entered the hospital for the last time. The album came out. The voice was there, as it had always been. Warm, assured, unhurried, crossing whatever line it needed to cross. The man who made it was gone. He had told his wife to go ahead and buy the house by the sea.